This is Archon 888, streaming live on the Theta.tv Edge node, the Theta Network's fully decentralized streaming platform. Tonight's presentation is called Panis, Canadian Indigenous Slavery in Canada from 1867 until the 1970s. Really, we're going to be talking about the residential school system in Canada. And by the end of the presentation, hopefully you'll know why I've chosen the title that I have. But we'll start, just for those of you that don't know much about Canada's residential schools, with a timeline.
For more than 200 years, religious orders run mission schools for Indigenous children, the precursors to the Government of Canada's residential school system. The Mohawk Institute becomes a boarding school. Run by the Anglican Church, it is the first government-funded residential school in Canada.
That's 1831.
A government report recommends Indigenous children be separated from their parents in order to assimilate them into Western culture.
In 44.
These recommendations influence federal laws and policies designed to strip Indigenous people of their culture and rights. Isle Cross opens in northern Saskatchewan. The majority of students are Métis. The government takes authority over Indigenous people and education for First Nations.
Okay, we become an independent country.
The Indian Act gives the Canadian government control over Indigenous rights and culture. The Act includes only First Nations as status Indians. It excludes Métis and Inuit.
9 years after Confederation,
Prime Minister John A. Macdonald authorizes the creation of the residential school system, which is designed to isolate Indigenous children from their families and cut all ties to their cultures. The number of schools across Canada quickly climbs to over 40. The Government of Canada requires First Nations children aged 7 to 16 to attend residential school. Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce exposes the government's neglect of Indigenous children's health, including alarmingly high death rates of residential school students.
and then uses them for experiments.
More than 80 institutions are in operation across Canada, the most at any one time. 4 students are investigated for arson. Others reportedly cheer as they watch the school burn. This is one of dozens of fires set by students across Canada as a form of resistance. Inuit children are officially included in the residential school system. 6 schools open in the Western Arctic as the government takes over the administration of many church-run residential schools. Grolier Hall and Stringer Hall open in Inuvik, housing 500 students. More than 20,000 Indigenous children are taken from their families by government social workers and placed in foster care or adoption homes, often with non-Indigenous families. Adoptees lose connection with their Indigenous language, culture, and identity. 12-year-old Chani Wenjak dies after escaping from the Cecilia Jeffrey Residential School. A formal investigation follows.
Escaping.
The all-white jury finds that residential schools cause tremendous emotional and psychological problems.
Escaping in 1966.
The Canadian government takes over responsibility for the remaining schools from the churches. Thousands of Indigenous students are enrolled at the 28 residential schools that are still running in Canada. Phil Fontaine, head of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, speaks publicly of the abuse he suffered at Fort Alexander Indian Residential School. He calls for a public inquiry, which the federal government initiates in 1991. Gordon's Residential School is the last federally run school to close. The report recommends a public inquiry into the effects of residential schools, including language loss and trauma. The government provides compensation to survivors, including the Common Experience Payment and a focus on funding and supporting Indigenous health and healing services. The agreement establishes funds for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the TRC. Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologizes to former students, their families, and communities for Canada's role in the operation of residential schools. Provincial and territorial apologies follow in the years ahead. After hosting events across Canada, the TRC releases a summary of its findings. It includes 94 calls to action aimed at redressing the legacy of residential schools and assisting in the process of Canadian reconciliation.
Stood there for a moment like as she got in this car and she went down that laneway and just out of sight.
From that point on, for the next 11 years, Geronimo no longer had a name. He became number 48, something he would later in his adulthood tattoo on his hand, alongside the word survivor, remembering the pain he lived through. He would join other Indigenous children from 6 nations. No names, just numbers.
The whole idea of these residential schools was to assimilate us. Yeah, assimilate us into the dominant white society, I guess you could say.
Now, this one school is the only one I've heard of. The only one I've heard of where the kids were turned into numbers. Other ones, they, had English names given to them.
And the way to do that was to take our culture and our language and our beliefs away from us.
And not just that, stories of abuse, psychological, physical, sexual. For Geronimo, the days began at 6 a.m., 7 days a week, woken from his sleep by staff.
Older boys would go out into the farm. They had a big farm here. Eventually I got out doing that at about 7, I guess.
The work followed by a short
So
breakfast
at
before
age
school.
7,
and overcooked oatmeal served
he's
every
doing
day
farm
with a glass
work.
of skim milk. If they were lucky, a slice of bread. Geronimo remembers a dump about 5 minutes away that some kids would sneak away to just to fill their stomachs, especially if they were pulled out of class to do more work on the farm.
Sometimes they would take me out of school. I think the government and the church's attitude was, well, they're just native kids, so they're not going to amount to anything.
And I
You
think
go to
that's
jail, drunk in a public place and
naive.
stuff like that. I went into the provincial institution and it wasn't that much difference from a residential school. As a matter of fact, I kind of felt at home.
So he goes into a provincial jail. And he's at home because it's just like being at the residential school. So what are these schools really about?
Someone was found to be absent. The place went into lockdown until the child was found and strapped for hiding and for not following the rules. If the missing child was not found, he or she would be considered a runaway, and the police would be notified. Reverend Marshall would go on a rampage. Anyone thought to be a friend of the runaway would undergo endless questioning about what they knew of the runaway's plan. If Reverend Marshall thought you were withholding information, or worse, not telling the truth, you would soon wish you had been the one who had ran away.
Hogan!
It was mostly boys who ran away, and they would usually do so in the fall of the year. Many would escape at night by sliding down from the third-floor dormitories on bedsheets tied together. Most runaways were caught and brought back to the school by the police or school staff. Some made it back to their homes, only to be brought back to the school by their parents as they were obligated to do. Some parents hid their children from the authorities.
Broke the law.
Unfortunately, many died from accidents and exposure, and their parents never learned of their fate. If a runaway was caught and brought back to the school, what followed was horrible. If the runaway was a boy, we were all brought to the dining hall for a bench party. Here, we would watch the principal administer punishment. The terrified boy would be made to expose his bare buttocks in front of fellow students and staff and be strapped repeatedly with a meter-long, heavy leather belt. A
3
total
foot.
head shaving often followed. The girl runaways who were caught and brought back to the school underwent the same punishment. but in the girls' dormitory. Whatever the punishment, it was intended to establish authority over a ragtag and defeated bunch of kids.
Make an
This
example.
was so obvious. By the smug way Reverend Marshall would announce the surrender of those spirit-broken, humiliated boys or girls whom he took such pleasure in beating.
You know, when you're a child of 10 years old and being locked up in a cupboard, you know, nothing in this cupboard but soap and dust. You're brought out at mealtime to watch the other kids eat, then you're put back in. And at the end of 4 days, they bring you out till you take a bath. Then the priest comes along and beats you with a strap, then cuts all your hair off. There's nothing you can do. And yet, you're told it happened a long time ago. Get over it. You know, I'll tell you, the story I just told you, it's me. When the priest finished beating me, he had gave me 500 licks with that strap.
Beat him like a runaway nagger.
When my sister came to get me that December in 1957, I was given a choice to go with my grandfather or go with my mother. I went with my mother. It took me almost a year before I could feed myself. I shook so bad, food wouldn't stay on my fork, wouldn't stay on my spoon.
Or there would be up to 60 of us locked inside a dormitory for the night. The electric generator would be shut off, and the few dim light bulbs would die, leaving us in total darkness until daylight. There was one toilet in each dormitory, and no sink for washing. If we needed a drink of water during the night, we would dip a cup of water from the toilet tank reservoir on the back of the toilet. This was a busy spot. There were times when you went to get a drink of water, you had to ask the person sitting on it to please lean forward so you could lift the toilet tank lid to dip yourself a cup of water.
In 1945, like many families living in Mamamatawa village, my parents were told that their children must go to school.
Now, if you're wondering why none of all of these people here are wearing, quote unquote, Indian clothing or traditional clothing, it's because at this time, under the Indian Act, it was illegal to wear such clothing.
So we moved 100 kilometers upriver to Pagwa River Village. My friend Esther has often asked why she and other Native children were made to attend residential school, while others went to the village day school. Unfortunately, time has erased the particulars, and I no longer remember why my sister Jemima and I were not sent to a residential school. At the time, the Indian Act stipulated the decision to allow an Indian child to attend a community day school was that of the local Indian agent. Many aspects of my day school experience were not unlike those children who attended residential schools. I remember well being aware that I was an Indian in a rather painful manner. I entered grade 1 in the Pagwa Village Day School at the age of 8 and had some traumatic experiences because speaking Cree, the only language my family spoke, was taboo at school. Within my first 15 minutes at school, I was strapped 6 times on each hand with a heavy leather strap for speaking Indian. My hands were so swollen from my first day's strapping that I was unable to hold a pencil for a week. It took much.
We'll be back with part 2 momentarily.